Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the Sharks lineup that they iced for their first preseason game of the year against the Los Angeles Kings, in which they won 3-2 in overtime. Now, unfortunately, I don't believe this game had any sort of video broadcast and was instead just broadcasted over the radio to listen to, and so I didn't actually get to see what exactly happened in this game. And obviously, Dan Rusanowski is a very fantastic radio guy, but there's a reason that they call it the eye test and not the ear test, so it is extremely difficult to evaluate how players played from just hearing from a second-hand source instead of being able to see it for yourself. So I don't actually have any sort of comments about how these players played last night, but instead I'm going to actually take a look at the lineup because it is very interesting. Usually for the first preseason game of the season, it is filled to the brim with just rookie type players who you don't really expect to actually make the team right out of the gate, and basically the team is pretty much just barely meeting the minimum for veteran players that you have to play. I believe you need to have 8 veteran, and that's veteran in quotations, play in a preseason game, because you could play a player like Labanc, who I wouldn't consider a veteran, but would technically fall under the veteran category. And so you would have likely seen players like Nieto or Labanc, or maybe like a Radim Shemek play in that first preseason game. But the Sharks, because of a condensed preseason schedule, because their first game of the season is overseas, or at least is expected to be overseas, the Sharks actually went with a much more serious lineup here in game 1 to try and really get a feel of things. And so if we start off just with line 1, we have Meier Hertl playing with Luke Kunin. Now, it should be noted, even though Luke Kunin is on this first line here, there are still a couple of usual Sharks players who did sit out for tonight's game. For instance, there was no Barabanov in the lineup. The recently acquired Oscar Lindblom was not in the lineup. Nick Bonino was not in the lineup. So it's not as though the Sharks iced exactly the players we will expect to see for that first game of the regular season, but they came rather close to it. And it's interesting that the Sharks are experimenting with Kunin on the top line with Meier and Hertl. It is also quite interesting to make a note of the fact that Meier and Hertl are actually being kept together, because they were relatively separate for the first part of last season by Bob Booner, but then later on, when they were placed together and were absolutely dominating things for the San Jose Sharks, it was something that the Sharks wanted to keep up. But the fact is that if you keep these two players together, these are the Sharks' 2 best forwards, and so you kind of neglect a bit the Sharks' second line, considering they don't have that many high-end top 6 talents, and yet they are being kept together here at the moment by David Quinn and being paired with Luke Kunin, who actually did score a goal last night. So whether or not he'll actually be able to retain this spot, or if Barabanov, who got the game off, like I mentioned, will end up taking it back like he had at the end of last season, it remains to be seen. But it's interesting that Kunin is indeed in the fold for playing the wing in potentially a top 6 role. On the second line, we of course had Couture also playing here tonight with William Eklund, and they were actually joined by Labanc, who I've heard many solid things about thus far through training camp over these last few days. That Labanc, after dealing with an injury that kept him out for most of last season, he seems ready to come in and compete for a spot this year. Obviously, Labanc's position is always potentially a ceiling for a top 6 forward, but in the past couple of years he has not really lived up to that and found himself playing further on the 3rd and 4th line, and considering he's not really a player built for that positioning, he sometimes finds himself as a healthy scratch as well. He is being once again trialed in this top 6 spot, and we'll see if he actually manages to lock it down once again. There were players not playing here tonight, so I had predicted eventually in my lineup predictions for the start of the season that a player like Oscar Lindblom might end up with that top 6 spot on the second line and not Kevin Labanc, but you never know. Labanc does have slightly more seniority with the San Jose Sharks, though under David Quinn, who this is his first year with San Jose, that might not actually have that much of an effect on things. Once we get down to the bottom 6 here tonight, that's where things get a bit more shifty and more preseason-y, I guess you could say. There was Bordeleau centering this third line center position. However, instead of being flanked by 2 players who you would expect to make the Sharks roster coming into the season, he was flanked by 2 players who very well might not even sniff the Sharks roster next year. That would be Seuss as well as Svechnikov, a somewhat recent signing by the San Jose Sharks. It's certainly possible that Svechnikov does play in the the upcoming season, but I very much doubt that CJ Seuss is actually going to be able to do so. And so Bordeleau not necessarily put in a extremely favorable position to succeed here in this past game, but still, at the very least, he is in the lineup. So the Sharks are clearly trying to get a good look at him to see if he can really indeed make the team right out of training camp. And then when it comes to the fourth line, I expect a couple of these names to definitely play a part in the Sharks roster for the upcoming season. VL, as much as I don't really like him, I imagine he'll probably still get a few games. I don't necessarily view David Quinn as the type of coach who's going to go full offense, and he'll likely try and get some physicality, enforcer style things going. Weatherby, we already saw him play about half the season this past year, so I imagine he'll get some games again this year. And then when it comes to Adam Raska, he's probably the most interesting one. He felt like a player who was almost ready to actually make the jump to the San Jose Sharks last season, but then after going to the AHL, didn't necessarily have that much success, and once again had a pretty decent showing, though very, very limited sample size, a pretty decent showing in the rookie tournament. We'll see indeed how he does here in the preseason. The Sharks do have a lot of competition for a fourth line spot, so I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if Raska doesn't make it into the Sharks main lineup, but he is definitely an option. On the defensive side of things, this first pairing also really caught my eye here for tonight, and that is a pairing of Karlsson and Nutivaara. This is, of course, Markus Nutivaara, recently picked up by the San Jose Sharks in this past offseason, who's actually playing on his offside here. I had predicted that Karlsson would be on the first defensive pairing with Mario Ferraro, and yet it seems as though they're actually trialing him with Nutivaara to maybe make up a bit more of a decently solid first pairing, to then have Ferraro be with someone like Ryan Merkley on the second pairing, because Ferraro might be more experienced to help Ryan Merkley kind of guide him through the throes of the upcoming season, even though, of course, Ryan Merkley, neither Ferraro either, didn't play here tonight. And so it's a very interesting first pairing here. Karlsson getting the look here tonight is also not that much of a surprise to see, how he looks in the upcoming season, just generally based on the fact that each of the past 4 years, Karlsson very much struggles to play a full season. On the second pairing, we did have Shemek and Benning, which is a potential tease for what we could have as a third pairing for the San Jose Sharks. I've mentioned time and time again that Merkley will likely slot into the second right-handed defensive spot, though I could definitely see Benning stealing that spot at least in the early parts of the season until Ryan Merkley maybe or maybe not establishes himself as a capable top four defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. Whether or not Shemek will actually be his partner remains to be seen. If Benning indeed takes that second right-handed defensive spot, he'll probably end up getting paired indeed with Ferraro, and then Merkley will end up on the third pairing with someone like Vlasic. We'll see exactly what happens with Shemek. I know he was very much upset with the San Jose Sharks this past season because he really didn't play a lot of games down the stretch, and he seems to be somewhat more encouraged going into this season, so maybe there was a talk with management, maybe there was a talk with the coaching staff that he'll be getting much more games coming up, or maybe that's just generally the fact that since he didn't get traded, he kind of has to just be happy about the situation that he is in. On the third pairing, there was the professional tryout Harrington as well as Onyebuchi on the third pairing. I doubt either of these players will play that much of a role here for the San Jose Sharks this upcoming season. It's very possible that Harrington won't even be with the San Jose Sharks if they decide to not sign him to that training offer. But Onyebuchi, I just find himself likely behind way too many players above him in the depth chart. And then finally, to talk about the goaltending, Kakinen actually got the start here tonight and apparently had an extremely impressive game, backstopping the San Jose Sharks to this victory. Now, we do not want to speak too soon. Of course, this is preseason, and I'm sure the Kings themselves were not icing the most competitive lineup that they possibly could, and we already have made the mistake in the past, just last season with the arrival of Adin Hill, who had a very solid couple of preseason games that we thought Adin Hill was going to be the next major starting goaltender for the franchise, and clearly that did not end up panning out as he was just recently traded over the past few weeks. So not to jump to any conclusions here for Kakinen, but of course it's certainly better than if he had had a poor performance in his first showing of the preseason. But that will do it for this review. Certainly a couple of interesting moves here by David Quinn on the lines, Cunnin on that first line, LeBanc on the second line, Nutivaara and Karlsson as a pairing. We will indeed see where the lineup goes as we progress through the preseason. Class dismissed.